Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, obviously the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Happy to have you here today. A lot of news from the weekend in some form, some fashion. It seems like a lot of it, not the best as it relates to UGA. Perhaps that's the case, which is all the more important then that we provide a little bit of a reminder for you about something we said a couple of weeks ago that seems even more relevant now than it was when we said it, although this is one of those examples of something probably playing out almost prophetically exactly as we thought that it might. We also got some really interesting stuff from Carson Beck. We'll try to figure out what that means. Georgia did make a coaching hire. This is something I believe that is undoubtedly a good piece of news here, so we'll cover a lot of that ground here coming up there as well. John Stinchcomb joins us to help make sense of all of this in the midst of that kind of crazy time in which it's signing day coming up, transfer portal still raging, coaching hire being made, NFL draft decisions being deliberated on, including for Carson Beck. It's almost like a roller coaster trying to hold on and kind of follow this as it goes up and down day after day after day, but obviously we're doing the best we can to do all of that. So let's talk about some of that here right now. As DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We're going to talk a little bit on the show today about certainty and uncertainty, and some things that I think that Georgia football and Georgia football fans can be quite certain about, and the certain level of uncertainty that you have to be somewhat comfortable dealing with here right now. Now, I don't talk about myself very much on this show, hopefully. The topic is Georgia football, and I just sort of facilitate the conversation. But I do want to talk about me just for a moment. Now, you can make a long list of things that I'm wrong about. You can't speak into a microphone as frequently as I do for as long as I have without getting some things spectacularly wrong. That's just the nature of the beast. I don't certainly take myself so seriously that I don't assume I want to make, a mountain, of errors. Obviously, that's just the way that's going to go down. But every now and then, we also do get some things exactly right. And I think it's important to give you a reminder that a lot of what is playing out for Georgia here right now, we sort of called this, and we did sort of warn you about some of this. We told you, hey, this is going to be a little bit unpleasant. And I want to rewind here for a moment to a couple of weeks ago, something that we said. And almost word for word, the exact way I described this then is sort of playing out right now. This is from the Monday after the SEC championship. That lost Alabama, the exclusion from the college football playoff. We're going to set off a chain reaction of events that are pretty much playing out right now exactly as we said that it would. So for some context for what we're about to talk about, let's rewind the show here a little bit and hear a couple of weeks ago what we told you was going to happen. This is me. My advice to you, though, is this is a period to be endured. It just is. The idea that bad news sort of trickling out slowly over time. Well, so-and-so's transferring. Now so-and-so's transferring. Well, now so-and-so's perhaps opting out. Now this person's perhaps opting out. Georgia is not fully insulated against any of that because no one in this spot would be. Everybody would have their version of that. And I truly don't believe it's the sky falling or some sort of problem with Georgia or anything obviously to panic about. What it is just an overall reflection of where college football is at this particular time. And Kirby Smart, who has figured out so much of the current landscape, is going to figure all of this out there as well. But the next few days is sort of like the worst part of the news cycle. And if you're not in the college football playoff, it sort of smacks you in the face here pretty hard. So we're going to cover it. We're going to talk about it. And as fans, we're also going to endure it because there is a much better future. But for now, probably not too pleasant. So let's get through this period, and then everything will be a lot better coming up after that. Is it fair to say that what I said on that Monday after the SEC championship has worked out to be almost exactly like I said it would be here over the course of the last couple of weeks? Most of us enjoy the Georgia football conversation on a daily basis, but the last couple of weeks it sort of feels like it's kind of been something more to endure than actually enjoy, that for those of us who are sort of here for whatever, the good, the bad, everything in between, the true diehard fans, that this has been one of those periods where it's like, once again, as I said it would be, kind of a slow trickling out of a little bit of bad news day after day after day. And it seems like right now the bad news kind of outpaces the good by a margin of and a factor of like 3-4 to 1, something like that. We believe there are transfer portal additions coming. Those announcements are somewhat slow in being made here right now, perhaps for good reasons, but nonetheless, those announcements are being delayed. Some of the recruiting stuff right now, Hayes been in the barn for quite some time. Therefore, ahead of National Signing Day, you're not hearing Georgia a big factor late with a lot of these, perhaps prospects are kind of out there on the open market. A lot of this is sort of an example of the bad news right now is just speaking a lot more loudly than the little bit of good news is here and there, and it kind of brings a level of uncertainty around the Georgia football program. And the fact that we said it was going to happen, the fact that most of you are sort of smart enough also to anticipate this happening, I don't think that necessarily fully insulates you from the feeling of, well, gosh, this is not as fun as last year was, and it's not as fun as 2 years ago was. This is not as fun as some of that is, and that's just real, and that's just kind of the way things are right now. So for a couple of minutes, let's talk about some of the uncertainty that exists around the Georgia football program. We'll start with this. You may have read this story at DawgNation.com over the weekend. Our friends at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution were on hand. Carson Beck doing a charity event, and there were some questions that were raised about Carson Beck's future. Now, on the one hand, we got confirmation of a small piece of good news, but on the other hand, the really big piece of news as it relates to Beck, no real clarity about that as of yet. Let me show you a couple of quotes from the DawgNation story, kind of tracing back to what the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote from Beck here. When it comes to the Orange Bowl, the quote is, "Yeah, I'm playing in the game." I mean, I think people know that, unless they don't. But yes, officially, I am playing in the game. So that is Beck saying he's playing the game. That in a lot of ways sort of confirms what we had reported at DawgNation, I guess, about a week ago, that when Georgia began its bowl practices, Beck was practicing the idea of, it's a holdout or whatever thing that's been sort of, described around Beck. Well, he's practicing, he's playing. That is that situation. He'll be a part of Georgia there in the Orange Bowl. Now, that in of itself is not enough to confirm that he's coming back in 2023 because, as a lot of you remember, Jake Fromm also played in the Sugar Bowl of 2019 and yet ultimately did not come back to Georgia for 2020. But we at least do have a confirmation. This is not an insignificant piece of news that Beck will play in the upcoming Orange Bowl, and he's going through those practices here right now. But he also is quoted as saying, as far as the pro decision goes, I'm not sure yet. I'm just actively thinking, but right now I'm focused on trying to beat Florida State. Our friends at the Athens Banner-Herald quoted him from the same media availability saying that it's the biggest decision of my life in terms of what he's going to do as far as all the NFL stuff goes. And I do get that. And I know that there are Georgia fans that have a lot of questions about what Beck's future is going to be, and is he going to come back, and how come it's taking so long to make the announcement, and how come this and how come that. And I sort of get all sides about this. I get the pins and needles aspect of Georgia fans dying to hear some sort of full resolution on the Beck issue, and obviously they're very hopeful that Carson, given the way that he played this year, will return to Georgia for 2024. I believe that he probably will. I think most of you assume that he's probably going to, but it's also fair to point out the longer he goes without confirming that for sure, the more that it does loom as a possibility that he might not. And, for a lot of Georgia fans, that kind of creates a certain level of restlessness about, well, how come this issue just isn't resolved? And I would say the reason that it isn't resolved is because of what Beck says in the quote that I just gave to you a moment ago. This is the biggest decision, anybody's likely to ever make, and certainly likely that Carson Beck is ever going to make. And I would say that Carson Beck is a pretty unique draft prospect from the standpoint that if you're Caleb Williams or Drake May, you're very likely to be a first-round pick. If you are a quarterback of lesser stature, for a fact that you won't be drafted nearly that high. Jalen Milroe obviously has had a very good season for Alabama, but he's not a big-time draft prospect, so therefore it's very easy for him to say, yeah, I'm coming back to Alabama for 2024. I'll be here. I'm running it back. There was really very little in the way of a draft decision for a guy like that to make. Easy for him to say that he is going to come back. But for someone like Beck, he's a little bit more of a tweener-type prospect, I guess. I mean, it certainly seems like he is climbing up draft boards. Some of this is media reports. Oftentimes that's unreliable. But nonetheless, there seems to be enough legitimate chatter here about Beck based on the way that he's played. He is kind of climbing that ladder of someone who could be a very impressive NFL draft prospect. And if you're drafted high enough, early second round, first round, you're talking about the kind of money that'd be hard to say no to. And from this standpoint, I think the best that I can tell, now we've talked to Jake Fromm about this, the best that I can tell is trying to find out as much specific information as he can about how high could I be drafted really? What is the actual evaluation of me really? And I think that's the reason, simple as it is, about why the Beck announcement hasn't come yet and why it won't come until he has some sort of clarity about exactly where he stands right there on that. It's fair to point out that Georgia is not the only kind of major championship contender style team that has almost no clarity right now about who its 2024 starting quarterback is going to be. We've seen Ohio State sort of jettison Kyle McCord, we believe. McCord's going to Syracuse, and as of right now, we have really no idea who the Ohio State starter is going to be in 2024. That's a team that thinks of itself as a championship contender. They've been forced to be somewhat comfortable with kind of an uncertain status for next year's starting quarterback. I would say that Georgia right now kind of finds itself in a little bit of a similar boat. I still believe when it's all said and done, Beck probably is coming back, but admittedly, I'm no different of a Georgia fan from most of you. I'd like to hear from him for sure and for certain to confirm all of that, because the longer this goes unresolved, the more Georgia fans just going to be feeling a little bit restless about all of that. Now, to add to that, you've also got what's going to happen with Dylan Raiola coming up on Wednesday. Raiola did take his official visit to Nebraska over the weekend. Matt Rule, and I'll show you this on the screen here for a moment, putting this out. It was a GIF. I didn't show the full GIF. I just took a screenshot. It's Walter Payton flipping his way into the end zone. The imagery here from Rule is unmistakable. That's his way of kind of calling for a flip after the Raiola visit. It sounds like Rule believes that's going to happen. Some of the online chatter says, I don't know, maybe still talking to Georgia. That's either true or a way to inflate interest in an ultimate decision for Rule on, or I should say for Raiola on Wednesday. Obviously, there's a way of viewing this that if it's a Nebraska flip, having that happen high profile on Wednesday with the world watching is of greater value for Nebraska and Raiola. That's what's going to happen. So maybe some of this sort of late contact with Georgia, maybe that's a way of kind of inflating interest in the ultimate announcement, which perhaps going to come on Wednesday, or maybe it is true that Georgia is still a factor in the Raiola recruitment and some form or fashion could prevent the flip from taking place. Obviously, we'll all be tuned in to watch this closely, but the uncertain status of the Raiola, or the slightly pessimistic view that it seems like he's more likely gone than not, I think only adds more, kind of pensiveness, is that the right word, around the Carson Beck type decision. That it certainly seems like Beck's status is uncertain, and perhaps independent of that, Dylan Raiola also seems like more likely than not on his way to Nebraska after taking that official visit, weekend this past week. And all of this kind of comes at a time as well when you've got the continual trickling out of some of these transfer portal names. We believe that Georgia will add some transfers eventually. We think those announcements probably come within the next week, maybe not prior to Wednesday, but at some point in time over the next week, that Georgia's perhaps added a couple of really good players, perhaps with SEC experience. That could be a fun thing to hear. But right now it is, as I predicted it would be, sort of a trickle out of players who, in some cases, maybe weren't playing as much as they would have liked at Georgia. In other cases, guys that you think could have very bright futures at UGA. But, kind of the next example of that was A.J. Harris over the weekend, the former five-star cornerback, defensive back signee for Georgia. Didn't play a ton here this year, and looks like he's looking to move out and move on after quite not having the first year on campus for Georgia that he would have liked to have had. And once again, this kind of speaks to what we predicted would be going on, losing players like this. So you've got all of this happening right now, where Carson Beck, we don't know what he's doing. Dylan Raiola seems like he might be looking to leave, going to Nebraska. And players like A.J. Harris, who Georgia fans don't want to lose, guys like this are going to the transfer portal. And what it provides is an opportunity for all of us to decide how we're going to react. How are we going to react to this? Even if we could say this is what's going to happen in some form or fashion, there's going to be this sort of series of bad news for UGA. Even if you sort of knew it was coming, the emotion of the moment sort of still leads you to have certain kind of reactions. And the question to ask is, how are we going to choose to react? Well, here's what I'm going to tell you. I believe in stuff like this. There's a right way to react, and there's a wrong way to react. I think the right way to react is to assume that, hey, the transfer portal is bringing about a new era to college football, and it's perhaps true that no one has this fully figured out as of yet. And everyone's just sort of holding on for dear life in the hope they can kind of endure all of this and be sort of okay on the other side. But coaches who've proven themselves to be smart, no pun intended, coaches who've proven themselves to be clever and nimble, that they will perhaps figure this out the same way they have figured out other things in the past. I believe that's probably the right way to react. I think there's also a kind of panic peddling wrong way to react on this, and sometimes the people sort of peddling the panic are just sort of random people on social media or message boards or whatever else, and in some cases these are people who have a little bit more prominent followings, and I think it's probably fair to sort of point this out and criticize it no matter how big or small the voice is that's doing this. And in fact, a guy that we generally speaking sort of like, Aaron Murray, the former Georgia quarterback, I have to admit I didn't like what I saw from him on social media here this weekend. I thought it was perhaps a bit unfair. Murray putting out on Twitter, I don't know if I've ever seen this many 5-stars leave a program before. What in the world is happening in Athens, Aaron Murray says. These top recruits, are they not liking all the competition? Listen, I like Aaron Murray, but I don't like this tweet, and I'm not going to allow my, I guess, like for Murray to prevent me from calling out something that I don't think is a helpful message at all. And in Murray's case, I don't think this is a helpful message whatsoever. Why are you peddling panic like this here right now? Why are you trying to stir things up when it comes to stuff like this? The idea, I've never seen so many 5-stars leave a program. Well, part of the reason that's perhaps true, although I think the actual number of 5-stars to leave Georgia is actually pretty small, but the point is, part of the reason why it seems like a good number of elite recruits are leaving Georgia is because no one collects elite recruits at the rate that Georgia does. No one brings in more elite recruits than Georgia does. So when Georgia has its 15 or so transfer portal departures, the way that everybody has, of course most of them are going to be elite recruits because that is all Georgia signs. Now, do they want to compete and play? Who knows? Who knows? But what Georgia's dealing with right now isn't really all that unique compared to any other program, especially the very best programs in college football. There is going to be some bad news to be endured when you don't make the college football playoff, and that is what's going on for UGA. But the belief here is, and this is the point of all of this here today, whether it be, whatever Carson Beck ultimately decides to do, whatever Dylan Raiola ultimately decides to do, and whoever else may choose to leave Georgia at some point in time before this transfer portal ends or before the spring transfer portal ends, later on in the year of 2024, Georgia's a program that has just shown an ability to kind of figure some stuff out. And I don't believe that Kirby Smart's currently got all of this figured out when it relates to portal and NIL, because I don't think that anybody necessarily does. But I also don't believe that any coach is more capable of figuring this out than what Kirby Smart is. So there's a few more days of a news cycle that's just not very fun. Opt-outs and recruiting this or, whatever else. It is just one of those things to be absorbed and endured. But on the other side of this, what remains just as true now as ever is that Georgia's going to have the building blocks to put in place to be a major contender in 2024 and perhaps beyond. Kirby Smart's navigated some very tough waters as a successful college football coach. He wouldn't be where he was if he hadn't. And right now, this is another thing to figure out, another landscape that's got to be navigated. And I wouldn't trust anybody to do that more so than I would trust Kirby Smart. And I'm pretty sure all of you agree with me as well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Pella Window in Door of Georgia, and we are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us. Live on video, we start 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app, 10 a.m. across all platforms after that, radio app and Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcasts. You know how to find us there. All the podcast platforms is our longest running, oldest platform, and on most days, still pretty sizably the biggest. So to those of you who listen on demand, we so much appreciate that. It's truly the only thing I want for Christmas is your continued support, and I am so thankful to have you providing it. Also, big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia, who make all of this possible there as well. Energy-efficient windows and doors. That's what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. And you kind of know the feeling this time of year. Do you and your family like to drive and go look at Christmas lights and things like that? We kind of like to do that kind of stuff. We're sort of the Griswolds in our house, so we're big into Christmas and those kinds of things. And I love when you drive through the neighborhoods and you see like the quaint, cozy houses. You kind of look through the windows, you see the Christmas lights going, you see the Christmas tree. And when you look and you see this stuff, well decorated on the outside, kind of cozy and warm on the inside, I think the feeling we all get is this is home the way that it's supposed to be. And one of the things that kind of creates that same feeling for you at your home are Pella Windows and Doors, products that are designed to kind of keep your home feeling nice on the inside, warm and toasty when it's cold outside, but also, kind of looking good on the outside there as well. Better curb appeal makes you a good neighbor, can perhaps also benefit your resale value there as well. It's the best way to take care of what is probably the most important financial asset you have, and certainly the sort of the deepest source of emotional connection, the home that you live in there with your family. Take good care of that by installing Pella Windows and Doors. And you've heard me say this for a long time, and so my guess is the next step for you is to have a free consultation with one of those Pella experts, because they can tell you a lot more about this than I can. I can say, well, it looks good and it feels good to touch, but their experts can sort of tell you more about the product line and why it really is viewed to be the best. They can also talk to you about financing options if necessary, installation options there too. You can do this with them at their Experience Center there in Duluth. They'll come in-home and do it with you there. Very easy, of course. No pressure always. They'll do a virtual consultation if you'd prefer to do that there too. A lot of ways for you to get in touch with Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Also, between now and the end of the month, December 31st, you can get 10% off your entire project, no payments, no interest for 12 months, plus an additional $500 off your project. Let me say that again because I want to make sure people understand that. You got a choice here. You can either get 10% off your entire project, or you can choose the other option, which is no payments, no interest for 12 months, plus an additional $500 off of your project. So make sure you give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Or visit them online, pellaofga.com/DawgNation. That's pellaofga.com/DawgNation. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. All right, we're going to talk to John Stinchcomb here in a moment. We're going to get into a lot of this with John. The uncertain status of Carson Beck, kind of what's next for Georgia as it tries to navigate all this transfer portal stuff and what's going on with Raiola and a lot of that. It's just a, kind of a wild time here with some of that. John's pretty level-headed, though. He's a good guy to talk about all of that kind of stuff with. But prior to that, I want to go around the doghouse. And look, we said one of the themes for today's show is the uncertainty and certainty aspect of what's going on in the college football program. And I just kind of rattled off a lot of uncertainty to begin today. You don't know yet what Carson Beck's going to do. You may think we do, and I think most of us kind of lean in one direction, but until it's official, you don't know for sure. You don't know what Dylan Raiola is going to do. You assume it's probably not great news. Otherwise, why would we have heard so much lately? But that kind of sticks out there as sort of an uncertain topic. Obviously, a lot of stuff around the transfer portal kind of much the same way. There's a lot of uncertainty around Georgia football. So leaning into certainty when you can is a very important thing to do. And around the doghouse today, that's what we're going to talk about, because Georgia stepped up, I think made a pretty aggressive, and the best I can tell, a very strong hire for its defensive backs coach, Dante Williams, making this official, kind of putting this out on Twitter. Georgia's also announced this there too, that Dante Williams, most recently of USC as their defensive backs coach, is now defensive backs coach at UGA. Now let me give you a couple of thoughts here on this. We'll let John Stinchcomb tell you some more here in just a moment. I realized that USC was terrible on defense this year, but I don't blame the defensive backs coach for that at all, right? I mean, it's like he's not going to have the influence over that program that an Alex Grinch would have had, or a Lincoln Riley as head coach certainly would have had. That if anything, the chance to escape from that culture and come be at a place like Georgia where there's a much better sort of defensive culture overall, of course that's a very good thing here. I don't hang any of the failures from USC defensively, and there were certainly plenty of those. I don't put any of that on Dante Williams, because Lincoln Riley's been a head coach now for quite some time in a couple of different places. His defenses have never been very good. It's him who bears responsibility for the lack of defense in the culture with the programs that he leads. I don't put that on the defensive backs coach. If anything, I'm happy for Williams to get a chance to escape that and come show what he's all about. And, beyond that, the one thing that Williams, this is obviously no surprise, comes recommended as is a wonderful recruiter. Georgia's not going to hire a position coach like this, an assistant coach like this, that is not a great recruiter. And sort of the same way that we thought certain things about Fran Brown, I think you think some of the same stuff about Dante Williams. One of the things we sold about Brown when he first came down here was not super well known to me, but from New Jersey. He was coaching at Rutgers before he got here. This was a guy that was going to be able to unlock a geographic territory. And you say, chance to recruit in the Northeast doesn't sound so great. But if you look at a state like New Jersey, the state that Brown was from, there's actually a decent number of pretty good players that come out of New Jersey each and every year. In fact, that's one of the places where Michigan had really tried to plant a flag in recruiting. And part of the recruiting success that Michigan had was because they kind of mined that fertile soil of New Jersey for pretty good players. And so we thought the presence of Brown was a good way to kind of unlock a geographic territory like New Jersey for recruiting. And I would say for the most part, that kind of worked out that way. It was kind of a pipeline to the Northeast, kind of a foray into the Northeast while he was here. Well, the same thing is true for Dante Williams, but it's a much more, abundant area for elite recruits. I'm talking about, Southern California and kind of out west. This is one of those things where guys out west oftentimes like to come down here in the South because it's just better football, more pageantry, more passion. They like that. And to have someone who knows that geographic area the way that Dante Williams does, I think provides a really good opportunity here for UGA. This is a good recruiter. This is a guy who had a big-time job, USC, one of the biggest programs that are out there, and Georgia was easily able to convince Williams to leave USC, come here to Georgia. So this is one of those things, even if Dante Williams wasn't super famous to you prior to this, and he wasn't super famous to me either, we're all in the same boat there on that, but I do think you should circle this in terms of if everybody's got the same question right now, which is, how well is my program maneuvering through all the crazy stuff that's going on in college football? Pretty much every fan's got that question about their favorite team. How well are we making sense of what seems to be like sort of wild and chaotic? Well, finding a way to kind of lean into certainty when you can as a way of enduring the uncertainty seems like sort of a wise course of action here. And while there's a lot around college football that's new and different than it's ever been before, one of the things that remains the same is you need young, upwardly mobile, energetic position coaches to handle all of this. You need guys that know how to go out there and just have an abundant level of energy. When you've got guys like that in your program, good things, typically seem to happen. And Kirby Smart has kind of always been pretty good at making these coaching hires. I would say it's not 100%. He hasn't batted 1,000. Nobody does. But in terms of identifying rising stars, in terms of identifying hungry guys ready to kind of pour their soul into a job in the hopes that gives them a chance to be upwardly mobile during their career, Kirby Smart's had a pretty good eye for identifying those guys. We would assume that Dante Williams is the next example of that, and we would say that in a time in which there's a lot of weird stuff going on that no one can predict and no one really knows where it's all heading next, finding some stuff that does feel familiar is probably a good place to sort of occasionally migrate your attention towards. And Georgia making a coaching hire like this feels like a very Kirby Smart thing to do, and that ought to provide a lot of comfort in what is otherwise a pretty tumultuous time. And that is also around the doghouse here on the program today. Now, before we are done, Georgia I don't want to say but is kind of celebrating some very good news for one of its players on the 2023 roster. We'll tell you more about that before our show is done today. Pretty rare achievement overall, which is worth celebrating, so we'll take a moment to do that. One of Georgia's 2024 opponents is also very aggressive right now in terms of bringing in transfer portal players, confirmed and rumored. We'll kind of give you some of that. So we'll cover all of those bases and all of that ground before we're done on the show today. But for now, on the looming decision for Carson Beck, the uncertain status around that, the navigating of the transfer portal, the brand new defensive backs coach, and all of that. Let's cover a lot of ground on a lot of things after another busy weekend for UGA as we do a Marlo's Tavern Insider Update with John Stinchcomb here today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
I want to bring in John Stinchcomb, Marlo's Tavern Insider Update with John. And John, we got a lot to talk about. Another kind of busy weekend here for UGA. But let me begin with the defensive backs coach hire. Now, you're going to impress me if you can run through the entire resume for Dante Williams and why you think that his technique makes him perfect for Georgia. I don't necessarily expect you to do that. I think my only kind of big takeaway on this is it just sort of feels like the coaching hire that Kirby Smart typically makes, sort of a young, up-and-coming name in the coaching ranks, probably upwardly mobile, certainly ambitious, a guy willing to kind of be very energetic here, both on field during practice and on the recruiting trail on a 365 day a year type basis here. It just sort of looks like the kind of hire that Kirby Smart typically makes, and finding that level of certainty at a time in which the rest of college football feels very uncertain and very chaotic. I think if you're a UGA fan, you should take some comfort in that. What did you make of the, was reported, now I guess it's official, that Dante Williams is the new defensive backs coach from Georgia, making the move from USC.
Yeah, I find that very exciting. Obviously, he's a high-level recruiter and has done so at a program that, this past year or two has not found a lot of success defensively, but I don't think that's to his blame. I think it's to his credit as to the level of players that he's still been able to recruit into a situation that was pretty difficult. I'm not, if I'm a defensive star, I'm looking there at a school under or led by Lincoln Riley going, I don't know if I'm going to be able to show my wares as much as I could in another place. So obviously high-level recruiter. If you're willing to walk into a situation where Kirby Smart and his background as a secondary coach and having played the position, along with Coach Muschamp, who's had a lot of experience at a number of levels and probably known most as in his ability with the secondary, if you're willing to walk into that situation and do so as a young coach with confidence, I think that speaks pretty well for Dante and what he brings to the table.
Yeah, I think it also kind of shows you that, the idea of national recruiting, which is something that Georgia's been very good at the last few years, even with all the talent here in the Peach State, national recruiting is not going out of style anytime soon for UGA. This is a guy that gives you a lot of access to very fertile soil out there in the West, Southern California, that western part of the country, which does produce good players. Just the sheer population of California would suggest they're going to be able to produce a lot of very talented players, and historically they have. Elite programs out there, St. John Bosco and Mater Dei and things like that. Georgia has recruited these schools, and a guy like Dante Williams, I think, would give you a chance to do even more of that in the future. So I think it also demonstrates that Georgia wants to remain a major player on the national recruiting landscape, and that's what Williams seems to be able to provide as well.
And we've had a lot of success bringing in players from the West Coast. I think one by the last name of Bowers would ring some bells with Georgia fans. So to continue to build and cultivate connections with the West Coast and specifically California and the fertile ground that has been for some high-level talented players, I think is a good thing. And Georgia is a national player. You look at the recruiting classes specifically under Coach Smart, and historically and consistently there is a number of players that choose the University of Georgia that extend well outside of the Southeast.
No, I think that's right. Moving on here, Carson Beck. We talked about this off the top of the program a moment ago. Speaking to some reporters here this weekend, does confirm that he is playing in the Orange Bowl, but at the same time doesn't really make any kind of apology for the fact that he is still deliberating on whether or not he's going to return to Georgia for next season or move on to the NFL draft, where we'd have at least some chance of being the kind of high draft pick that financially it would make sense for him to go onto the league if he would be drafted as high as perhaps the top-end projection suggests that he might be, but there's also a chance that that's a little too ambitious for where Beck currently is, just given his limited amount of experience as a starting quarterback there at UGA. What do you make of the uncertainty surrounding Carson Beck's future here right now?
Well, I can certainly understand where he's coming from. I think he's focused on the duty that lies nearest, and that is right now I need to focus on the Orange Bowl. And I'm aware of what's happening outside, and I'm sure fans would love some level of commitment. But for Carson, that's not the top priority. The top priority is the Orange Bowl and playing well and leading this team in the opportunity that we have. And then afterwards, and hear me say, B.A., I mean, it's not like he's totally put it on the back burner. I'm sure there's still active participation in the process of evaluating what's best next steps. But making a public announcement one way or the other doesn't behoove him in situating himself to make a wise choice. I'm sure he's still taking in information, and let's be honest, NIL package and where he could possibly be in the draft are two major factors in this decision, along with what opportunities lie for him outside of just the football field. So I think it's pretty smart for him to make the declaration of, yes, I'm committed to the Orange Bowl, but past that, I'm still, kind of weighing my options and trying to make a wise decision that does not need to be made today.
Let me ask this to you, and I tried to talk to Jake Fromm a little bit about this last week. Jake's obviously been through this. You, a different position, but you've also been drafted in the NFL. I think the thing that those of us who were not NFL draft picks have a hard time understanding is how much certainty can Carson legitimately get about where he'll be drafted? In other words, if I'm given a range of possibilities of, I could be a high second-round pick, which is a lot of money and potentially a pretty significant future, but I could also fall to the fourth round, let's say. Well, there's a huge degree of difference between that, right? That's the difference between kind of life-changing money versus something that's just kind of rich, at least compared to typical typical NFL players. And in terms of how you're treated, I mean, we see mid-round draft picks sometimes sort of cast aside because there's just not a lot of financial commitment on the part of the franchise, to that player. So if I'm Carson Beck, I mean, I would certainly want to know, okay, what do the NFL scouts really think about me? But how certain can I be? Is this really a promise of, so-and-so says that if you're there, they are definitely drafting you no worse than 40th overall? Is it that certain, or is there still a certain bet on yourself you have to make if you're Carson Beck, given the best available information you can receive?
Oh, yeah. There's still a level of uncertainty for every player. I mean, let's take, the high-end guy like a Travon Walker who's going, you could be a top 5 pick or some mid-level, mid-range first-round pick, and he goes first in the draft. That's a significant amount of money that he, took a bet on himself saying, I think I can go pretty high here. And there's others that have weighed the equation and taken in the information and, probably would have benefited for another year. And there's a list of Georgia players that would fall into that category. But there is no certainty. There is good information, I think helpful information that's provided. I think there's a number of services, and even 20 years ago when I was coming out, that they could project roughly where you would be if you were to decide to leave early. And I did that with 1 year of eligibility left, kind of got that information, and that was a data point that I used in trying to make those decisions as to whether it was best to come back or head on to the NFL. And I think guys are doing the same thing. Now, there's added points of information to their equation that is much different, and this is the fact that there are some guys that will probably take pay cuts when they go to the NFL, and it would probably make more financial sense to stick around and receive some of this third-party NIL benefit and that you can receive in college now. So there is, and I think we've seen this across the board, there's guys that are looking at it going, I could either be a back-end draft pick or possibly even a free agent, or I can come back for another year and make some pretty good money. And, even with the NFL rookie minimum being $750,000, there's guys that still look at that equation and say, you know what, I think it makes sense for me to come back for another year.
Do you think that it's weird or in any way problematic that Beck hasn't said anything yet?
No, I don't find it weird at all. I think there's probably been some better conversations that have had with his coaches and specifically Coach Smart, and they probably have a better understanding as we would from the outside. But I don't think it's odd from the outside looking in that he hasn't made some public announcement that, this is where my head's at.
It's John Stinchcomb here. It's our Marlo's Tavern Insider Update with John. I want to talk about some of the other stuff that's going on around UGA in a moment. Let me remind you prior to that, always happy to have John as our Marlo's Tavern Insider here each and every week, and we want to invite you to also take advantage of all the great things going on at Marlo's Tavern right now, too, including great gifts for this holiday season. There are, sometimes it seems like the guys in your life, are the hardest to buy for. You have a son, you have, brother, something like that. Sometimes it's just sort of hard to know what to buy guys for Christmas. And this is where Marlo's Tavern, I think, can provide you a great opportunity here, because who doesn't like chef-inspired food? Who doesn't like the kind of craft cocktails that Marlo's is famous for there as well? And who doesn't want to get exceptional value, especially during this holiday time of year? Well, that's what Marlo's Tavern can provide for you. When you give the gift of Marlo's Tavern this Christmas and holiday season, you're going to get a great thank you for making that decision. When you buy a $100 Marlo's Tavern gift card, you're going to get a bonus $25 gift card just for free, just on top of all of that. So it's a great way to take advantage of the best of Marlo's Tavern and get a bonus on the gift cards that you buy, which is always going to be well received by whoever you give them to. Also, if you want a chance to kind of enjoy something yourself, you can give the gift of the $100 gift card. You can perhaps keep the $25 gift card for yourself. All of that is a great option for you here this holiday season. We've been telling you about this for years. It's a lot of fun, and it's a great gift for you to give somebody this Christmas and holiday season. So make sure you go to marlostavern.com to find out more about that. That is marlostavern.com. Get the big bonus gift card here this holiday season when you buy that $100 gift card there from Marlo's Tavern. All right, John, so the other thing that's kind of out there right now, that kind of continuation of the sort of names trickling out of Georgia into the transfer portal. The latest example of this was A.J. Harris over the weekend, the former elite defensive back recruit. And we predicted this. I talked about this 2 Mondays ago after the SEC championship. And I think we even talked about sort of the idea of the bad PR of, a little bit of stuff kind of trickling out slowly over. So the slow drip of bad news is never a good thing. It always makes things seem worse than they are. We said that's what it was going to be for Georgia, and that's exactly kind of what it has been. Like, what do you think right now about the fact that Georgia continues to, every couple of days, sort of lose a name of from its roster ranks of players that I think under the right circumstances could be very good? It's kind of creating a little bit of a negative response from some. What do you make of how all of this is playing out here right now, and the fact that we think there's good transfer news coming from Georgia at some point in time? Those announcements haven't been made as of yet, but right now it's sort of bad news outpacing good news by a fairly sizable margin. Well, how do you process all of that?
Yeah, and it has taken some processing from my end as well, and I think you have to come to the reality of we actually need a few more players to transfer out. And it's hard because we all get excited this time of year with signing day coming up, of the proposition of what these players could mean on the football field wearing a big G on the side of their helmet. And for some guys, it pans out exactly how we project it to, and for others it does not. And if you look at the transfer list, there's a number of guys that you understand, or there's some sting to, and there's others you go, man, I think there's still some promise left in this player. I'd like to see them stick around to see what their development looks like. And unfortunately, you have to kind of take the good with the bad. But the reality is that I read Connor's article earlier on where just with the current list of players and the signees, the projected total is 97. So that's his projection. But it does bring up a good point that the way college football works these days, if we want to sign some of these transfers that are available, we actually need to get some of these scholarships that are sitting with players that may not contribute in ways that they originally projected to.
I think that's right. Let me finish with this on this same topic here for a moment. I think one of the things we have to process as it relates to some of this kind of stuff, those of us who are fans here, for years, kind of the lifeblood of our conversation has been getting excited about elite recruits. I don't mean to be overly cynical, but if a guy like A.J. Harris, who everybody was excited about when he first, signed with Georgia, when he first committed to Georgia, but almost nobody thought was like an immediate impact day one player, because Georgia just doesn't have that from, freshman defensive backs very frequently. Does this change the level of excitement we ought to have about recruits if, a guy comes in, but if he is a developmental player in any way, form or fashion, which most elite recruits are going to be at a place like Georgia, should we be just less excited about elite recruits moving forward because, if they don't play their first year, they may get restless and leave? Like, for those of us who are fans, John, how much does this change the way we kind of cover and think about recruiting, do you think?
I think we're constantly trying to adapt to the new age new parameters that exist in college football. And I still think there should be excitement with a developmental player that you say, man, he's got some serious high upside. But I think now part of the equation is, will we be able to hold on to him? Would it make sense for him to be a part of this program, knowing that he may not see significant action for 3 years? There are fewer and fewer players that are willing to stay the course. And there's fewer and fewer programs that are willing to invest in that form and fashion. You look across the board, and I think Georgia's kind of become a little bit of an anomaly for the way other teams are looking to build. They're saying we can supplement with some pretty well-established players that have played at the college level for 2 or 3 years. I think Georgia has been on the conservative side of how we've utilized the transfer portal, picking 2 or 3 guys here and there. 2 years ago, we didn't have any transfer in. So it's been much more of a homegrown, we want some of our own to develop, and we're excited about the propositions down the road, or we're recruiting at a level that, you know, we've got these 4- and 5-star guys that come in fairly game ready with very little development needed, or at least, you know, after a year, the expectation is you're the guy. So it's I think we're all adapting, not only just the coaches and the players, to the way things have changed, and there's less opportunity for the quote unquote developmental player to, you know, kind of hone his skills over a 3 or 4 year process sometimes. And now, as fans, we're seeing the same thing, that maybe, you know, we're going to have to acquire talent that's been cultivated in other fields, so to speak.
And just a real quick follow-up to what you're saying there in terms of, like, fans having to recalibrate. It's not just signees like A.J. Harris. It's also the news of a possible flip for Dylan Raiola here, taking the official visit to Nebraska over the weekend. You got any response to that, the idea that Raiola is a guy that Georgia fans have been kind of counting on for quite some time, and now it seems, you know, pretty likely, not a guarantee, I don't guess, but pretty likely that Raiola is going to end up elsewhere too. That's a lot to get used to for fans there as well. The guy like this would change his mind this late in the process.
Oh, yeah, and I'm a fan as well, right? And we are greedy. We are a greedy group of folks that we want all the great players, and we want all of them right now, and even if they don't stick and sit, and, you know, that's the nature of the beast. And I understand the frustrations when you have a guy that's been committed to Georgia that might be looking elsewhere, but if that's what he thinks is best, he'd rather go to play at a Nebraska and behind those offensive lines, and the NIL money that's available to him, you know, is able to balance that equation. Then I wish you well, man, because you know, I've seen their product, and it is not near the level of play that, you know, the offensive line performance at Georgia has been. So, you know, if Carson Beck comes back, if Gunnar Stockton continues to develop, I'm sure fans are aware of this, but Raiola was not our only highly rated quarterback in this recruiting cycle. So there's other talented players. Obviously, when you throw into the equation Vandergrift leaving for Kentucky, and we're a greedy bunch. We want all the great players to be on our roster and not play for anybody else, but that's just not the reality, especially when, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but Raiola has played at 4 different high schools in his 4 years of eligibility. And to think that, and he's committed to 2 different schools in the process. So to think that, you know, it would be outlandish for him to consider his options on an annual basis, I think is probably more conjecture than based on experience of what we've seen his decision-making process to be.
John, really good stuff. I always appreciate your insight on matters like this. You've obviously got such great experience, and so it's wonderful to have you here as part of our Marlo's Tavern Insider Update. Hope you and your family are continuing to enjoy this Christmas season, and we will look forward to having you back on the show again very, very soon.
I always appreciate it, B.A. Merry Christmas, Dog Nation.
You too, John. Thanks a lot.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, Christmas is coming, so we got some stuff to do to get you ready for all of that, and we will talk about that in the days to come here there as well. Let me just say this real quick before we kind of transition to our cruise around the SEC as it relates to some of the recruiting stuff. We're obviously getting ready for Wednesday. It seems like it's going to be a relatively quiet, at least based on things right now, relatively quiet Wednesday for UGA in terms of the kickoff of the early signing period. We talked on Friday's show about some of the fireworks in terms of the elite prospects late in the cycle here. While it does seem, I think, fairly likely, maybe not a given, but fairly likely that Raiola will flip from Georgia to Nebraska. Some of the other big names kind of late in the process here. I think there's growing optimism, on the part of the schools currently holding on to those commitments that the big-time prospects might stay where they are. It seems like coming off the weekend, Jeremiah Smith staying at Ohio State, seems like that may have picked up some steam. DJ Lagway staying at Florida, maybe that's picked up some steam here. Maybe even like KJ Bolden, which at this point would not be Georgia, would be more likely to be in Auburn. Maybe there's some growing optimism that Florida State's going to hold on to KJ Bolden there too. And I would say that in terms of Georgia holding on to the number one spot, now I'm not great at math, but in terms of Georgia holding on the number one spot, Florida State may be one to watch in terms of, because like Georgia just losing Raiola alone, subtracting those points from the overall ranking is not enough to move Georgia down. But if somebody does have like one of these aggressive, really late hauls, that might give them enough points to kind of supersede UGA. So it could be Florida State could be worth watching there on that, because if Jeremiah Smith does go elsewhere, that's a spot that's been kind of, kicked around. The idea that LJ McCray might go there, late in the process, that's been kind of, kicked around. Florida State may be worth watching, but for now, holding on to Bolden, I think there's some growing optimism in Tallahassee. They might be able to do that, but obviously a lot of this is still very much up for grabs here. So we shall see. Big prospects kind of, going through their deliberations as of late. I guess there was some Edric Houston, kind of moving around here a little bit too. So could be interesting to see how a lot of that plays out. We'll obviously follow that, not just for Georgia, but across college football as we head towards Wednesday and the start of the early signing period. For now, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And obviously we are very excited about all the things that Royal Caribbean's got going on in 2024. You've heard me talk about Icon of the Seas a lot, but I also want to talk to you for a moment about another brand new ship that Royal Caribbean's got on the way for this upcoming year, too. Have you heard me mention Utopia of the Seas before? I think this is a really fun one that you ought to be aware of, because it's a brand new kind of idea from Royal Caribbean. Typically speaking, the larger cruise ships, and for a long time, kind of pre-Icon, the largest class of ships for Royal Caribbean was the Oasis class of ships. And typically speaking, the Oasis class of ships, the largest and oftentimes newest cruise ships, they've been reserved for the 7-night sailings. But in this brand new year of 2024 upcoming, Royal Caribbean is going to debuting Oasis-class ships on a 3- and 4-night itinerary. It's a chance to enjoy the best of the biggest Royal Caribbean ships on a shorter cruise for those that kind of fits their budget or perhaps fits their time constraints. It's a really exciting new option. And in July of this upcoming year, Utopia of the Seas, the newest Oasis-class ship, will be doing the 3- and 4-night sailing. So it's a great time to talk to Jessica Slater, a terrific travel agent. She can help you out with all of this. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she'll tell you all about the great new things that Royal Caribbean has on the way, including a really exciting debut of a couple of brand new ships, including Utopia of the Seas, coming up there in July. So this is of interest to Georgia fans as we go cruise around the SEC here for a moment. Ole Miss is very aggressive right now in the transfer portal. They have officially brought in Juice Wells, the former South Carolina wide receiver. That's a big deal for the Rebels. They're also working very hard to hold on to some of their current players. We know that one of their top receivers is coming back. There's also some chatter about Jackson Dart, things like that. They bring in Princely Ullman from Florida, and they're also rumored to perhaps be a major factor. In fact, I think they're getting some online predictions as it relates to Walter Nolan as well, the former 5-star leaving Texas A&M, who's moved about a few places. That Walter Nolan is thought to be a potential acquisition by Ole Miss here there as well. That one of the things that Lane Kiffin is like selling himself as is what he's called like the Portal King, or transfer to the SIP. They do all the kind of branding around that program. And in this particular offseason, it seems like there's some real chatter around that. There's some real juice around that. And Georgia travels to Ole Miss here, late 2024. That's a pretty big deal for Georgia to see one of these, already fairly tough SEC road games by appearances getting much tougher here. And, Ole Miss was 10-2 this year, losing the two games that mattered most, but winning, the rest of their games here thus far. And the kind of portal acquisition we're talking about Ole Miss making right now are the kinds of acquisitions that I do think can make Ole Miss a pretty big factor here. And frankly, one of the contenders for the college football playoff in the SEC based on the kind of talent they're currently bringing in. This has been a pretty big offseason thus far for Ole Miss, and it does not show very much in the way of signs of slowing down. Now, former Ole Miss coach Hugh Freeze is also in the news, and he's not quite as happy with how his team has navigated the transfer portal here thus far, perhaps not as successful in bringing in elite players as Ole Miss has kind of been. Freeze was speaking out recently during a media availability and saying, I don't think I've handled it very well, meaning this portal window. It's just being truthful. We want to build this program through high school for the most part. Having said that, I don't know if you can ever isolate yourself into saying that's what's going to happen because you don't know how many you're going to lose at this time, if that makes sense. And what Freeze is talking about there is the kind of simultaneous issue of you've got players you want to bring in, but also you've got players you're hopeful not to lose. And sometimes your ability to go out and chase the players you want to bring in is lessened by the requirement and the necessity of holding on to players that you don't want to lose. Like anybody who's ever done sales, you hear this in marketing sometimes, that it's 10 times more expensive to go out and get a new customer as it is to keep an existing customer. Have you ever heard that before? Most salespeople, most business owners would probably say that's true. And I would say that when it comes to college football, that's also kind of true as well. And I don't just mean from like an NIL standpoint. I mean the level of resource required to go out and obtain a new player from scratch requires a lot more manpower than just keeping the guys you have. And I think what Hugh Freeze is saying here is you get frustrated by the amount of time you have to spend working to keep the guys on your own roster that you don't want to lose. He goes on to say you can plan, hey, we're going to replace these 20 seniors with 20 high schoolers, but then all of a sudden you've got 30 spots and you haven't recruited enough high schoolers for those spots, and obviously you have to go to the portal then. He says, I think our calendar is extremely messed up. No one would disagree with that, of course. He goes on to say, I don't think it's good for high school recruiting, portal recruiting, manage your own team, getting ready for bowl prep. I think our calendar needs a serious look at what's best for our game. It's hard for any of us to truly manage all of it, he says truthfully. So this statement from Freeze sort of circles back to what I said off the top of the show, that right now everyone is dealing with the uncertainty of how do you manage this portal situation the best that can possibly be managed. And what I told you before is I trust Kirby Smart to figure it out. But that's not the same thing as saying I know for a fact that Kirby's got all of this figured out and all of this behind the scenes is sort of playing out exactly as his master plan suggests that it would. No one has it figured out. Everybody's going along for the ride, and you're just hoping to sort of manage this the best that you possibly can. I think it's interesting to hear Hugh Freeze in a moment of honesty saying, I'm not quite so sure we have figured this out very well right now. It seems like we've done some things we wish we'd have perhaps done a little bit differently. The other point about this, and this is one of those things that I do think, is kind of, worth monitoring here a little bit. The one thing thus far that hasn't happened, now maybe the Ole Miss example that I cited earlier is an example of this happening, but the one thing thus far that kind of hasn't happened is the idea that a team is going to completely transform itself via the transfer portal. That's something that Auburn tried to do prior to this season, and it didn't work. LSU brought in like 13 transfer players, the overwhelming majority of them on defense. Their defense this year was terrible. Florida has sought to supplement a pretty weak roster with a lot of guys to the transfer portal. No team has gone from bad to good, from irrelevant to contender on the basis of the transfer portal. It just has not happened. And so some of the frustration I think that Hugh Freeze is expressing here is, it's believed that Auburn's got a pretty large war chest, pretty expansive NIL opportunity here, but there's just not enough good players to bring in to completely transform your roster totally. It's one of the reasons why I think people kind of scoff at what Deion Sanders is trying to do at Colorado. It's just really hard to remake yourself through the transfer portal and have great success doing that. Almost no one's really done that. And, if you're trying to build a program on the basis of that alone, you're probably not going to have much success because there's just really no track record to confirm that's even really a possibility. So I would take what Hugh Freeze is saying there pretty serious. I think he's being honest. I think he's being candid. And I think he's telling you this current calendar is very hard for any coach to figure it out. And Freeze is pretty open in saying, I'm not really quite so sure we're figuring this out too well. I'll also give you this. This is not a this is not official, but it's one of those reports that's out there, that former Vanderbilt quarterback A.J. Swan could be considering South Carolina. This is interesting because Swan obviously lost his job there at Vanderbilt. He was injured for a minute, but eventually that became kind of a coach's decision to play the other guy instead of Swan. Of course, a lot of folks know A.J. as a former Atlanta area high school player, but South Carolina a year ago was ravaged via the transfer portal. I think they were hoping that they'd do a little bit better in that portal here this time. They did bring in Rocket Sanders, the former Arkansas running back, so that's, I guess, a pretty good ad for them. Is Swan the appropriate replacement for Spencer Rattler? I don't quite know about that. South Carolina is actually doing pretty well in high school recruiting here right now, supplementing that, as we were talking about a moment ago, supplementing that sum with success in the transfer portal could be a good way for Shane Beamer to kind of get back to bowl eligibility in 2024, something the Gamecocks were not here in 2023. So let's watch what they're able to add. A.J. Swan perhaps, and for Georgia fans, a little bit to process here too of whatever they do or do not add. It's actually not that relevant for Georgia right now because the Gamecocks, for the first time in a long time, are not on the Georgia schedule for the upcoming season. Interesting stuff on that front, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, as we get ready to near the end of our show, let me give you a shout out to our friends at Dr. Pepper, because nearing the end of the show always kind of brings about a certain Pavlovian response for me. My mouth starts to water because I know I'm only a couple minutes away from being able to enjoy the rich, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper. It's my sort of personal treat for myself once the show comes to an end. I'm going to invite you to do the same thing, whether it be watching college football, you're watching bowl action. There's a bowl game today, by the way, maybe a couple. You're doing all of that, or you're just enjoying your Christmas time, holiday time with family and friends. Dr. Pepper goes great with all of that. So as you're shopping at your local Kroger or wherever it is that you're doing your shopping here this time of year, pick up the rich, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper, whether it be the cherry flavor, the strawberries and cream, Dr. Pepper Zero Sugar, the original Dr. Pepper, whatever you want. Great thing to go with this time of year. It truly is the one fans deserve. All right, so I want to share some good news here for a moment, and an honor certainly worth celebrating before we kind of wrap things up here today. Kind of nice to see this sort of laid out here this way. Obviously, we've seen a lot of the All-American teams kind of coming out, and Brock Bowers, once again, kind of a consensus All-American. And in 3 years at Georgia, he's been an All-American in each of those 3 years, and that puts him in a pretty rare class when it comes to Georgia football overall. I wanted to celebrate this for a moment. That, as Georgia football points out, Brock Bowers now joins David Pollock and Herschel Walker, how about that for rare company, as the only three-time All-Americans in Georgia football history. Now, isn't that cool? Three of the greatest players in program history, the only three-time All-Americans at Georgia. In the case of Herschel and Bowers, All-Americans in all of their college seasons. Each of those guys playing just 3 years, All-Americans in all 3 years. Obviously, Pollock, one of the all-time great defensive players in college football history, and certainly one of the great dogs of all time. What a cool and an amazing accomplishment that is, and how fitting is that for what we believe is the end of Brock Bowers' career, that he joins Herschel Walker and David Pollock in that rare company. So a good job by Georgia for making us all aware of that, and certainly a rare feat worth celebrating when it comes to Brock Bowers. Kind of a cool way to finish off today's show. And as we wrap up, also some fun to make fun of those lousy, stinking Gators. So I saw this story. It's just too funny not to share. Florida football kind of continues to be the gift that gives on giving during this holiday season. How about this bad piece of news for the Gators in recruiting? Yahoo Sports reporting this. There was a JUCO target in the transfer portal whose only offer was from Florida. He canceled his Florida official visit, decides to retire from the sport entirely instead. So pretty funny stuff there on that front. You laugh at all of that. And we'll give a golden shoe out for that, for the humor as it relates to that. That is our golden shoe for today. How about those lousy, stinking Gators? 1,136 days. That's how long it's been since they have beaten Georgia. And that's the number that we look to see keep climbing up and up and up and up. Fun stuff indeed. Kicking around those lousy, stinking Gators never goes out of style, and a great gift for us this holiday season. We'll see you tomorrow at DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cooldown. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. So let's get your comments here. I'm going to go to Facebook first today. We'll roll through some comments there. and then get everybody else involved here too. Hope you had a great weekend. Kind of getting ready for Christmas, kind of finishing touches on your shopping and everything else that goes on with that. Hopefully you're having fun with all of that. All right. Let's see what folks have going on. Betty Power says she loves Cherry Dr. Pepper. Betty, I'm glad to hear that. That's awesome to hear. Brian Whitaker says I'll be a Kentucky fan next year or two. While Brock Vandagriff is up there, I really hope he shows out, except for when he plays us. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to cheer for Brock Vandagriff. And I'm like you. I hope he has success up there as well. Let's see what else. Steve Rogers says, will there be a DawgNation invasion to Miami? No, I will be there. I will be personally invading Miami, but I don't know that we have a DawgNation invasion plan. But if you are there, let me know, and we'll try to say hello to you at some point in time. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on. Yeah, so a debate going to go over here. Brian Whitaker says, any more news about Julian Humphrey? That's not Julian Humphrey. That's the other Humphrey, London Humphrey. So here's what I believe the conventional wisdom is on London Humphreys, and this is sort of based on people who probably know more about this than I do. I think the consensus opinion is that Humphreys is coming to Georgia, and the consensus opinion is that's going to be announced at a later date for whatever reason. I haven't heard anybody say that the delay in announcement means that Humphreys is not coming. I think it's widely assumed that he is. I just think it's widely assumed that the actual announcement on this takes place at a different time. So that's what I believe is going down there on that. And maybe, I think it's less certain maybe on Trevor Etienne, but perhaps it's the same kind of deal here, that Georgia arrival announcements via the portal will happen later as opposed to prior to signing day. I think that's the conventional wisdom. Bill Sanders says the conventional wisdom is really either conventional or wisdom. Maybe that's the case, but in this particular spot, I think it's probably going to turn out to be true, that Humphreys probably is coming, and the announcement happens sometime later, for whatever reason. Kevin Drummer says you got to get the defensive line help. Yeah, obviously, I think that's the biggest position here this offseason. Now, it certainly looks like Georgia's not going to get like one of the big-time targets that's out there. Seems like no one's probably going to Ole Miss. Seems like LT Overton's probably going somewhere else. Probably not going to do like the big additional defensive line flip here late in the process. Probably not doing that either. So where does that leave you? I think it leaves you a couple of places here. And admittedly, this is going to come across like a little bit of spin control. But nonetheless, here's where I think that leaves you. It leaves you hoping that you see a lot of development over the course of the next year when it comes to guys like Christian Miller and Jordan Hall. Those are guys who I think are thought to have very bright futures. I think they're expected to be at Georgia next year. And seeing them kind of emerge as elite defensive line talents could be one of those things that takes place. That is certainly a situation worth watching. And there's also a possibility of some of like we know Zion Logue is moving on, but we don't know yet officially on like say Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse perhaps. And this is one of those day and ages where it's very hard for me to keep up with with who's got eligibility and who doesn't. But I think it's just sort of broadly assumed that almost any Georgia player, I think there's like one player that's not true for, but almost any Georgia player that actually truly wanted to come back still could. Between redshirt or COVID or whatever else, almost the entire roster, with the exception of maybe like one or two guys, could possibly come out, which obviously includes, Brinson or Stackhouse. So veteran presence coming back, maybe one or both. Emergence of one or both between a Miller and a Jordan Hall, that'd be a very good thing. And then also looking at kind of that next level of transfer portal defensive line acquisition. I know the former South Carolina defensive lineman, is that Xavier McLeod? He visited here some of that. Between those three things right there, those are sort of your sort of tri-pillars to build defensive line improvement with, I believe. Let's see what else. Jason Glossier says, so do we go after coaches we want, or do they apply for the open position? I would say, obviously, there's an HR process that has to be followed, but like, most things in life, it's pretty clearly you identify who might be a good fit here, and, there's overtures made. Almost all of this is made via back channel. See, most of what, like, coaches and administrators say about the hiring process is what's the old, like, line, it's legally accurate, but it's not, quite in the spirit of honesty. I haven't talked to anybody about so-and-so job. All of this is done via back channels. And so, therefore, everyone's got plausible deniability about everything because the entire process is sort of a back channel conversation until you get down to the very end. And so that's how a lot of that kind of stuff sort of plays out. Kevin Drummer on the subject of needing a cornerback. Well, I think what you're hopeful for there is to hold on to cornerback. That, obviously Dalen Everett, either fairly or not, is in the crosshairs with some Georgia fans a little bit. And so that's why there's hope that Georgia can hold on to Julian Humphrey. Obviously, we're not going to play dumb here. There's clearly a bunch of rumors as it relates to Humphrey's status for the future. Thus far, nothing's materialized with that. So keeping Julian Humphrey, I think in some respects, would almost be like a portal acquisition because I think some Georgia fans were bracing for him to leave. Thus far, that's not been the case. RB Media 323 says Coach Williams is a great recruiter and defensive backs coach. That's certainly great to hear. MG says that Lane's trying to prove he can take our throne. Well, he's certainly in kind of a win-now mode, right? And in some respects, it kind of makes some sense. Ole Miss is the example of the kind of team who, I don't want to say their schedule gets easier, but if you're in the SEC West, not having to play the entirety of the SEC West anymore, that probably helps you a little bit. In fact, let's see if we can see what the Ole Miss schedule for next year looks like. Do they still play Alabama? Let me see this for a second. So you're out of the SEC West. You can beat, if there had been a 12-team playoff this year, Ole Miss would have made it. So, they've got, at Wake in the non-conference. They also play Middle Tennessee State, Georgia Southern, Furman. Then their SEC schedule is Kentucky at South Carolina, Magnolia Bowl at LSU, probably a pretty tough game. Yes, they don't play Alabama next year. Ole Miss does not play Alabama next year. Ole Miss's tough SEC games are toughest SEC games are at LSU, home versus Oklahoma. Ole Miss has a chance to be favored in that game. And then Georgia. So 2 of their away games are like at Arkansas, they should be favored. At Florida, they should be favored. South Carolina, they should be favored. So you've got a couple of things going on here. You've got an expanded playoff, which gives Ole Miss a chance to be in it. You've got a much easier schedule than what typical SEC West deal for Ole Miss has been, that it's actually probably pretty wise for Ole Miss to be in kind of a win-now mode given those things. Let's see what else. JG, we're talking about teams transferring their way to great success. He says Florida State did well in the transfer portal. Yeah, they brought in Keon Coleman, guys like that. Jonathan Aaron also mentioning Jamal Jarrett. Yeah, that's another one you got to mention there too. Thank you, Jonathan. Jamal Jarrett is got to be mentioned there too, because especially with Zion Logue leaving, Jarrett, you hope, is your kind of next big sort of like, what do you call it, like a zero technique or whatever else, but like the over the center nose guard, run stopper. That's the role that you hope that Jarrett's able to fill for you, and that's an important one. So yes, the development of Jamal Jarrett could be a big deal there too. You're absolutely right about that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Let us see what else. Big Red Dog and others have been talking about Chaz Chambliss in here, and I do get this, that there's a certain like dynamic level of player that you want your defenders to be, and Chambliss hasn't quite risen to that level. And trust me, when I'm talking with my friends and things like that, I can promise you I have talked plenty about wanting to see more of Marvin Jones Jr., wanting to see more of Damon Wilson, wanting to see more of these elite recruits. And I told you the other day, I've got my eyes out for, okay, does Marvin Jones Jr. leave and go have great success getting to the quarterback in somebody else's system? If he does, that's not going to be great news for me, I don't think. But at the same time, knowing what these other guys from a talent standpoint perhaps could be, the fact that that Georgia still gave the snaps they gave to Chaz Chambliss, I think maybe speaks to, on a daily basis in practice, what Chaz was perhaps doing, what those other guys were perhaps not doing. That if those elite talents were not beating out Chaz Chambliss, and if you would say, well, Chambliss may be somewhat lacking compared to what you would expect a program like Georgia to have coming off the edge, whether that's fair or not, true or not, if that's the prevailing wisdom, and then Chambliss was also holding off these other guys from playing time, then I think that sort of tells you something about what those other guys were perhaps not doing. And, for like a guy like Damon Wilson going into year 2, you hope that changes. So we'll see. But, it's obvious that this was not a great year for Georgia defensively based on its own typical standards. And the issues on the outside edge were, I think, the biggest vulnerability this group had. Jalen Jackson says, I'm getting the sense that Carson Beck may be leaning towards leaving. The longer he delays, the more likely he's leaving, kind of reminiscent of Jake Fromm when everyone expected him to come back. I guess so. Obviously, Fromm did play in that Sugar Bowl, so clearly Beck playing in the Orange Bowl is not confirmation of anything. I guess this is the way that I would process this. There is a certain statement, if Beck were to hear it, automatically he would be gone. Like if he hears decent certainty that he could be a first-round pick, then clearly he's – so I think the way I would describe this is he appears to be waiting because there is some news he would like to hear. That, Beck's preference would be to leave. Beck would only come back if the news that he wants he doesn't receive. So those of us who think he's coming back, and it's not meant to disrespect Carson, but those of us who think that Beck's probably coming back, we're saying this on the basis that I believe he's not a first-round pick, may not be a guaranteed second-round pick, and so therefore makes sense for him to probably return. But, this is not one of those emotional deals where, oh, man, Beck is dog through and through, and, you're going to have to pull him out of Athens, kicking and screaming. Obviously, I think that Carson Beck has certainly enjoyed his time here at UGA and would obviously, I think, have a great time coming back to Georgia for one more year. But this is the same sort of pragmatic approach that anybody else would take, which is if Carson Beck could be a number 1 pick, of course that's what he would rather do. And if he could be an early second-round pick, given what that might mean for his future, of course, probably that's what he would rather do. So, this idea that he could leave, I think the basis for believing that is that if he was, to receive some certainty that he might be drafted at a certain threshold or higher, well, then at that point in time, that would probably be a very easy decision for him to make. He probably would leave. I think the prediction about Beck returning is sort of, in a roundabout way, kind of based on the notion that he's probably not going to quite hear that it might be a little bit more likely that – because keep this in mind, Beck does not have a ton of experience, and that's one of the things that will – right now – this is true for all draft prospects. This is one of the reasons why I don't love the draft process. Is right now, every draft process is sort of seen in the best, most favorable light. But as we get closer to the draft process, the media and certainly the teams themselves start looking to disqualify players. Every decision is based on the basis of disqualifying other options. Decide is sort of like homicide. You are killing off other options. And so as you get closer to the draft process, these teams start looking for reasons to disqualify potential draft picks. And one of the knocks on Beck will be the limited amount of experience that he has. He has not played very much. And NFL teams typically would want more experience from their quarterbacks than that. Not always. I guess Trey Lance, Josh Allen, they got, some NFL love without a ton of experience. So it's not always the case where you have to have a lot of experience. But typically speaking, teams would typically want Beck to have more experience than he currently has. That may be one of the things that brings him back here to UGA, which is what most of us would certainly like. William Perry says, help me understand this. We've known we need 15 roster spots for it to free up. We've had 16 transfers, likely most of whom were told to leave. Why does everyone act like that's a bad thing? I think, William, it kind of comes down to the slow trickle of bad news. That when something kind of comes out a little bit here and there, it just has the tendency to sort of feel worse than it actually is, because it just kind of, it's a sort of a slow drip over time. And I don't doubt that there are certainly some of these players that Georgia probably encouraged to go seek more playing time somewhere else. That's also probably not true for all of these. And there's also this thing where, like, within the fandom of Georgia football, certain people kind of gravitate towards certain players. That kind of becomes their guy. And, Xavier Sori is probably somebody's guy. That's a guy that somebody really believed. Marvin Jones Jr. is kind of my guy. I kept waiting for Jones Jr. to be at his best. When my guy sort of leaves, a little disappointing. A.J. Harris was probably somebody's guy, a lot of people's guy probably. And so that's what some of that is that in addition to the sort of slow sort of trickle of bad news, each and every one of these prospects at one point in time, had some devotees. And those devotees kind of, they're disappointed. And then the next guy has his own devotees, and they're kind of disappointed. So it sort of creates this sort of amplified negative news cycle. That's what I believe it is anyway, if that makes sense. Let's see what else. Paul Moon on the subject of what Malik Murphy could possibly be. Yeah, I mean, obviously the other day we talked about that around the idea that more of a replacement for Raiola than Beck, but it does seem like, Murphy's taking some visits right now that don't include Georgia. So that would kind of give more light to the idea that he's an insurance policy in the event that Georgia needed another quarterback post-Beck. So the visit pattern on Murphy right now, I do think tells you something there on that Georgia's likely to only get involved in the event they were to lose Beck. And, it seems like a guy like Murphy, who's a backup at Texas, not a fair trade for a guy like Beck, who was Georgia's starter, if that were the case. But, you're probably not going to make a fair trade on that point. And as I mentioned in the show a little earlier, I'd point to the issue at Ohio State right now, where I think the Buckeyes have no idea who their starting quarterback is going to be next season either. By comparison, Georgia probably a lot better shape overall with the notion they do believe that Beck is coming back, and they'd obviously like for that to be the case. George on Tap says these projections are so wonky, many times not even close. I think that's true for the media projections, especially the early media draft projections. They are notoriously terrible. I do believe that privately the players get better information than sometimes is revealed publicly. I do think that's the case anyway. But, I mean, you certainly can't make a draft decision on the basis of what, like, Mel Kiper is saying. You can't do that. You're absolutely right. All right, some more comments. Motivated Dedicated says Beck is coming back. He's too smart to leave after 13 starts. I think the problem with that, though, Motivated, is, I believe your ultimate prediction is going to probably turn out to be true, that Beck probably is returning. I think the one thing, though, that has to be acknowledged in this is that undeniably, undoubtedly, Beck's stature as a draft prospect has risen, limited starting experience or not. His status as a draft prospect has risen. And I think if you're Carson, it is naturally true that you would want to get full understanding of just how much it has risen. But you certainly wouldn't want to shut yourself off from a possibility while some of this chatter is still ongoing. Big Red Dog says he thinks that Murphy might want to go back to the West Coast. I'll tell you this: I think that Malik Murphy's a pretty good quarterback prospect. I don't know how good he'd be at Georgia. I don't know. But, Murphy was generating all kinds of chatter at Texas last spring. He beat out Arch Manning to be backup quarterback. Murphy's a pretty good quarterback prospect. I'm not telling you, I have no idea what he'd be at Georgia, and I'd certainly much rather have Carson Beck be the starter than Malik Murphy. But I do think that Murphy's a pretty good prospect. Aaron Dixon on the subject of Marvin Jones Jr. There is the possibility, as Aaron and others kind of alluding to, there is a possibility that he's just not it, that he is not him, to use the parlance of the time. There is just a chance that's true. And sometimes that is the case. What you hope, though, is not the case. It's that somehow that wasn't a fit at Georgia, but some other program uses him in a maybe more simplistic way, and all of a sudden he has a level of statistical success somewhere else that he wasn't having here. Like, that's a tough thing to shake if that does become true, because Jones Jr. would not be the first guy for that to happen for. And I do think you'd have to be careful about that. 478 Dog says, I'd rather have Dante Moore over Murphy. I'd say Moore's the better prospect in that comparison. Moore's probably going back to Michigan, right? Is that what that is? Going back to Michigan? Is that right? Jalen Jackson says, we keep talking about this being a quarterback deep class, or a deep quarterback class. Beck would easily be the third or fourth quarterback in this draft. Penix and Nix are nowhere near better prospects than Beck. Yeah, I just don't know that I can use the word easy on that, Jalen. I mean, a lot of this is in the eye of the beholder, and it depends on a lot of other factors there too. I don't think it's easy to know exactly where you slot. I don't think so. DeMarco Thomas says, Beck's holding out his decision. Quarterback's not waiting. We don't need a last-minute answer when it's a no. Then where would that leave us? I get that, but I would say that Beck's value to Georgia is significant enough that, of course, Georgia's going to play this waiting game. Of course they are. And I think most of the deadline around this is kind of artificial anyway. I think that Beck has been unfairly maligned, just to be completely honest with you. I think that people have kind of spun this into something negative when I just think it's the most understandable process in the world. Of course you'd want to know. I hope he stays. But if he has a attractive enough draft option right now, obviously he would probably leave there at that point. This is a little bit like a 2016 turning into 2017 when it's Chubb, Michelle, guys like that, Lorenzo, Davin, guys like that, but especially Chubb and Michelle. You were a much better team with them. You were nowhere near as good a team without them. And there's really only so much you can do to mitigate the possibility they might leave. In the case of Beck, look, I mean, is there any transfer quarterback that would be equal to losing Carson Beck as it is? I don't think so. There's a chance that, if Beck were to go in, perhaps when does the portal window close for this winter? Because I guess that's, something to consider here. Draft deadline is, of course, January 15th. Beck going to the portal might put someone in the portal that's not currently there, between now and the time that this, kind of window sort of closes down. But, I mean, it's not like you're going to get a quarterback that is as, polished and proven as Beck anyway, because that quarterback for the most part just hasn't really existed. Maybe Cam Ward's that guy, I guess. He certainly seems to be commanding the most attention here right now. Dante Moore, maybe the second most, maybe. But, I mean, you're looking at a drop-off at quarterback if Beck leaves almost no matter what, because there aren't very many quarterbacks this past year who played better than Carson Beck anyway. That's important to keep in mind. RB says the portal window closes on the 2nd. Thank you, RB. I appreciate that. Thank you. Bruce Farmer says, for all the people that believe that Beck is leaving after one season starting, I have a bridge for sale in New York. See, Bruce, here's the problem, though. It's like I get the idea. Everybody wants to be sort of alpha, and so coming into the comment section and being super alpha. Oh, I know exactly what's going to happen, and you guys are all idiots if you don't know what I know. And Bruce, I think you're a good commenter. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying I don't think there's any reason to make the certainty around decisions, more certain than it actually is. That the longer this goes without an answer, of course it's a possibility that Beck could leave. And I do believe. Now, I don't believe, sometimes the camp would have you say, they'd say something to the effect of, we're not even thinking about this right now. And money's not a consideration. It's going to come down to however we feel in a given moment. I'm too cynical to buy into some of that kind of stuff. Of course they're thinking about it. Of course they're weighing all options. Of course that's true. And there is, I think, some clouded evaluation of how the teams are evaluating him. If it's high enough, I do believe he would leave. It's probably not going to be high enough, but it might be. I mean, we've seen NFL teams do strange stuff before. They're going to try to get their answer there on that. So, Bruce, I think you're a good commenter. I think you obviously understand a lot of the stuff around this situation. I think that you were overstating the level of certainty that anybody ought to have on this. Crow King 123 also pointing out that if you get drafted late first round, you also have a potential of being on a much better team, which is probably also true. 478 Dog excited about having Jaden Riddell on campus. Yeah, that's a good thing. Surfer Boy 3000 says a second year starting for Beck could be epic for Georgia. I totally agree with that. DeMarco Thomas says if Beck did leave, what quarterback would you take from the portal? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't hate the Murphy part of this because I'm going to tell you right now, and I'm not saying that you should put all your eggs in this basket. I don't. But if Beck were to leave, I could be talked into believing that Gunnar Stockton could also be a very good quarterback. I do have a lot of belief in Gunnar. But I'm not telling you if Beck were to leave, therefore Georgia's right with Gunnar. He's next up. Don't have to worry about anything. That's not what I'm telling you. What I guess what I'm saying is I would probably want the kind of quarterback that created the opportunity for some competition, where Gunnar would have his shot and that other person would have his shot. And for the most part, that's who it's going to be. I mean, like, let's say the sky was the limit and you could just get any quarterback you wanted. Like, who's the best quarterback you could even bring in? I mean, like, I'm talking about of any quarterback currently in college football. Like, I mean, who just really just sort of blows you away? I mean, we saw Childs leave Oregon State. Where do you go? Michigan State. I mean, like if you could have anybody, you know, is there really like just some obvious name here? KJ Jefferson. I saw where Will Rogers is going to Washington. We probably should have mentioned that during the other portion here. You know, I don't know. Curtis Williams asking about a press conference. Kirby should speak on Wednesday. He typically does. I don't think that's been fully confirmed as of yet, but he should speak on Wednesday. And they'll, you know, in the past it's been like half recruiting, half like college football playoff. Obviously, there won't be as much of that this time because the game is less significant. But he will probably talk recruiting and also some general football issues. He'll probably mostly sidestep the question about Beck. You got to imagine, you know, probably won't say a ton about some of the guys they're losing. Certainly won't say very much about the guys they're likely to bring in. But you'll probably get something from a template standpoint pretty similar to what you've had in the past, which is a lot on recruiting and then some on the general team issues. Motivated and Dedicated also points out that Ryan Puglisi could be a sleeper, and I think most people kind of think that's true, for sure. Philip Clark says, take Jalen Milroe just to get him away from Saban. There you go, Philip. There you go. That's not a bad idea. All right, let's see if I can get some more Facebook comments here for a moment. Chase Smith says, what I don't want is Beck to use the Orange Bowl just to try and improve draft status and then leave. That gives us the worst of all worlds. No Gunner playing to prep for next year. No Raiola, no Murphy. I guess that's the case, but, I mean, I really don't believe that Georgia is going to be caught flat-footed on this. I don't. Now, it is true that if you're not taking a transfer, let's say that Beck left and I'll wait till the 15th, portal window closes, and you had to like go out and get a portal quarterback in like the spring time of year, that would not be advisable in terms of that guy really being ready to be, you know, big time player for you. That would probably not be advisable. But I mean, you couldn't get a good one, you know, if it's a guy that you know, that entered the portal because the Georgia job became open. So, you know, that's also an option there too, although you'd probably rather have, if you're going to have a quarterback compete for the job, you know, Beck kind of won a lot of people over based on what he did in, like, say, January and February. And if that's a guy at Georgia who's not even there during January and February, that's obviously not going to make it quite as easy. So yeah. Is it T.A. Stovall or Ta Stovall? Maybe it's Tay Stovall. Excuse me. Tay Stovall says the quarterback that just signed that dude can throw bullets. Yeah, there are a lot of people who like Ryan Puglisi. There really are. A lot of people who like Puglisi. That is very true. Kevin Drummer says Kirby really wants a mobile quarterback. I mean, I think all things being equal, we're probably entering into a day and age in the sport now where you do want that mobility, I believe. If you can get it, I believe you probably do want that. Let's see what else. Somebody also mentioned DJ Uiagalelei. Yeah, the Uiagalelei thing is kind of weird because, I mean, there's some talk of like Florida State being involved with him. I mean, I'm not trying to pick on DJ, but we saw him not be particularly good at Clemson, had his issues at Oregon State, and now it seems like he's kind of a major player on the transfer portal scene again. And I think that just gives you an idea that, the idea that the people who say, oh, we got to hurry up and try to find our transfer quarterback if Beck leaves, hurry up and get who? I mean, like, it's not exactly, the most enticing market here at the moment, unfortunately. All right, last comments across all platforms. Herb Hamilton on the sort of the pre-draft stuff as it relates to Jalen Carter. Yeah, there's obviously that. Go Dogs, give you a Merry Christmas. Go Dogs also says that 15's my guy. Pray he stays another year. Yeah, that'd be good. That sure would be good. Third Will also says, guess what today is? It's check-in day for our Royal Caribbean Allure of the Seas trip in February. He says, I'm going to get it ready for y'all, warn the staff and such, hashtag Go Dogs. Third Will, that's awesome, and I hope you have a great time. Keep us updated on your preparations for all that. Love that check-in day because that's when it starts to kind of feel real. So I'm really happy for you there on that. That's awesome. That's awesome. B-Mac on the subject of Dejon Edwards. Yeah, that's a guy we haven't really heard too much from yet on all this. B-Mac says it's weird that UGA also plays Ole Miss in back-to-back years. Now, when I was growing up, all the way through like a portion of the 1990s, Georgia actually played Ole Miss every year. They stopped doing that on a yearly basis when the SEC went to one permanent opponent from the West and then one rotational game. But it used to be that Georgia did play, Ole Miss every year. So playing them more frequently over the course of this 2-year span is a little bit more in keeping with the way that it used to be. Randy Hall says, when's the Joe Moore Award being announced? I'm not sure. I know that Georgia is kind of in the mix of that, but I'm not sure when that is. DT says that Gunner's a mobile quarterback, just needs to teach him to slide. Yeah, Gunner in high school kind of did that Tim Tebow thing a little bit where he would lower his shoulder and just kind of run straight ahead. Hard to do that in the SEC and get away with it. That's probably a fair point. Randy also giving us a Merry Christmas in here. Yeah, Randy Hall, I'm not sure when the Joe Moore Award announcement is. Let me see if I can find that. That is, let's see if it comes up. All right, so the finals were named on December 5th, and the eventual winner, I don't see it. I don't see it. I'm sorry. Hard to see it on the fly. But it's got to be coming up, you got to think. B.A.'s cardigan, which, by the way, I saw the famous cardigan that B.A.'s cardigan references the other day. I was going to wear it on Friday. I'll wear that again pretty soon here. But no, Raiola has, at least not publicly, to my knowledge, signed anything with Nebraska, but it is widely considered a strong possibility that he will flip, perhaps make that announcement on Wednesday. Jonathan Aaron asking about Puglisi and his mobility. I believe he does have some of that. I don't know how much mobility, but I believe he's thought to be a pretty good athlete. I don't know, you'd say dual threat quarterback, but I think he's thought to be a pretty good athlete. Savage Dog says if Beck leaves, we are an 8-win team at best, period. I think that's overstating things. 8 wins at best. That's I would say overstating things pretty significantly. But would there be a downgrade in expectations if Carson Beck leaves? Of course that's the case. That is the case. Like, there is a certain level of insurance that you can't guarantee yourself. If Beck leaves, Georgia's probably worse. And I don't know that there is a transfer quarterback that Georgia could go out and get and prevent that from being true. Like who is bringing in the kind of like quarterback prospect that, just sort of guarantees success. I don't know that anyone's doing that here right now. So, I mean, it is possible that, it's possible that he could leave. Don't believe that he will, but it's possible that he could. And it is very possible that Georgia takes a pretty big hit if he does. I don't think that's the difference in 0 regular season losses and 4 regular season losses. I don't think that's the case. But could it turn like 10-2 into a ceiling? All of a sudden you're trying to achieve that 10-2, 9-3 type mark to sort of stay in the expanded playoff conversation, and that task being made much tougher? That's reality, folks. That's reality. MG says, I think that Gunner could lead us to a championship. That's also a possibility there, too. Now, you can't obviously guarantee that, but, Gunner Stockton was a big-time prospect there as well. Zilch in the way of experience, but in any – if Beck left, and just to kind of like be crazy for a second, if Arch Manning said, oh, gosh, I almost went to Georgia anyway, now this quarterback situation's open over here, I'm going to go to Georgia. In a quarterback competition that included Arch Manning or included anybody, I'd still give Gunner Stockton a real chance. In a quarterback competition, you've heard me say this before if you're a regular listener, in a quarterback competition that included Dylan Raiola and Gunner Stockton, I'd give Gunner Stockton a real chance. I'd give Gunner Stockton a real chance in a competition against probably almost anyone. Now, I can't tell you how good he would be if he got a chance to play, but I'd give him a real chance. I really would. But there's also a possibility when you have that level of quarterback uncertainty that you do take a big step back. It is just possible. It is possible. Let's see what else. Savage Dog says, get real, no back, no playoff. As said before, I think that you would have a little bit of a downgrade in expectations. Once again, there's this alpha desire to be like absolutely certain of everything. Do you know how often I have sat here and watched this comment section be absolutely certain of things that turned out not to be true? I mean, for a whole month, we forget this because of everything that's happened since then. But for a whole month, I had all these alpha commenters in here with absolute certainty that there was no point in Georgia even playing Michigan because Georgia exposed itself as a fraud in losing to Alabama in the 2021 SEC Championship. Absolute certainty from huge pockets of people. I know that all of this has been sort of stricken from the record, and no one would ever own up to this, but I sat here for a month trying to explain to people that the outlook for Georgia was far more positive than people realized on the basis of this loss to Alabama in the 2021 SEC Championship. It's easy to forget that because Georgia went 29 games without losing to anybody, but there was a time in which Georgia fans did not think their team was capable of beating Michigan because of what they had seen in the SEC Championship. This sort of absolute certainty does not actually make the conversation any better. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. So in the role that I'm in, I'm going to try to be as clear as possible, but in terms of certainty, I think it's pretty silly to be overly certain about too much given college football's ability to surprise you. Let's see what else. Herb Hamilton says, drink a Dr. Pepper on the air. I've earned it. Well, Herb, I appreciate that. Actually, I'm going to say goodbye to you all and drink one here right now. Thanks for being here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. I'm actually going to have lunch with Dari this week. I'm looking forward to that. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. R.S. Andrews can do all of that for you. So hope you all have a great day. Y'all check them out. Get your heating system tuned back up to factory fresh specs. R.S. Andrews will do that for you. And then I'll do this for you. I'll come back tomorrow. We'll talk more about what's going on for UGA, heading towards signing day on Wednesday, trying to hold on to all of the craziness around all this transfer stuff and maybe getting a day closer to getting some resolution on Carson Beck. All of that is to come. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.